So have a look through this and see if you can find some similarities with your roadmap. Do you see very similar sections, similar pieces of the puzzle? This is called the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. It's a mouthful, isn't it? It is really talking about the elements or the pieces of a puzzle that you need to have good quality, integrated framework for geospatial information within your government. And you can see that it's not just about data, is it? Data is only one piece of the puzzle, but it's the piece that we in particular in the geodetic community focus on a lot. The governance aspect, having good governance structures and institutions who are responsible, having policy and legal components, and then having financial rules and regulations plays a very important role across that theme. And there's sort of three themes of governance, technology, and people. So the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework is something that has been developed within the United Nations within GGIM, and this is a big part of what they're talking about in the room over there and have been this week. What we did with the roadmap is we looked at all these themes and then developed the roadmap to suit each of these elements from a geodetic point of view, because we recognise that all of these elements are very important for you getting support for Geodesy. So good governance is critical for the development of your geospatial reference system, because it will ensure that not only is the geospatial reference system you develop accurate, but also that it's sustainable, widely adopted, and effectively managed. And something I heard from a number of you when you were talking yesterday was that you had technically developed the datum, but it may not have been accepted into policy, and you were having trouble getting certain groups in your community to use the new datum. This is because all of those elements need to be in place in order for the new datum to be integrated into your country. So it includes things like having a strategy, having policies, having a legal framework. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how that's been done in a few different countries. In Australia, there was a Spatial Information Council, and it included Australia and New Zealand. We were doing this work together. And it included all the states and territories inside those discussions as well. And it was getting recognition of the fact that we needed to modernise the geospatial reference system in the country, and then that was adopted into our legislation and government regulations. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 2021 took a similar approach. They have the General Authority for Survey and Geospatial Information, and they have a board of directors. They approved a widespread adoption of a Saudi Arabia national spatial reference system. That affects the surveying operations and geospatial data management. These high-level government bodies play a very important role to give you a mandate to go and do the work that you need to do. The importance of governance also ensures that we do things like have compliance with international standards, helps us with international collaboration and compliance. It can also help you with coordination and collaboration. As I said, having these national scale government bodies set up with representatives from land management, transportation, defence, environmental agencies, including in some cases private sector, Indigenous groups and academia, is very helpful. If you have a well-defined governance structure, it can help you with the coordination, collaboration, and hopefully improve the awareness across government and help you get uptake. It will lead to things like improved funding and sustainability, stronger awareness across government, and hopefully risk management, particularly from a financial point of view. Normally what will happen with these national scale government bodies that you set up, you'll probably have the mapping area or the geodesy area, if they're not connected, often take the lead role for this committee, because you are the one who needs to coordinate and get collaboration across all of the different groups. So if you currently don't have a body like this within your country, whether it's called a working group or a committee, whatever it might be, this could be something you want to talk to your boss about establishing to try and get that support all the way across government, and it gives you an opportunity to take the lead and chair these meetings. Then you can invite people from land management authorities, water authorities, defence departments, air services departments, maritime services departments. Space agencies in some countries, standards bodies, people who deal with data stewardship. I mentioned the other day that, you know, the ISO work, the OGC work, might not be something that you want to take responsibility for. Find someone else who's really good at this and get them involved in it, and then it takes it off you and you don't need to do it. Metrology. We have a metrology agency in Australia. They define weights and measures, distance, position. They define the regulations on what that is in your country. Do you know who knows if they have one of these metrology agencies within your government? Have a look around, investigate, because these people can be extremely helpful if you don't know them, or if you know that they exist but you've never talked to them, go and talk to them. They're very, very smart. So if you're trying to come up with policies in your country about how to legally define position, or if you're going to upgrade your geospatial reference system, they need to be spoken with, because if you don't have it in the policies and the regulations, then it's not going to be legal. Policy and regulatory, funders and donors. That can be inside government, or it could be how you engage with the private sector. You can also consider how are we engaging with capacity development and education. Do you want to have a role for your academic community on these kinds of boards or these kinds of committees? I think they're very valuable to have that kind of engagement, because you need to be building up that next generation. And of course the Indigenous communities, and that's important from a traditional knowledge point of view. It's also important for land leasing, land rights. We can learn a great deal from people from those Indigenous communities in our countries. So here's a sample structure of what this could look like. As I said, you want to have a steering committee that is working across all of government, and these would be very senior leaders within your government. They set the strategy and the vision, and it makes sure that you have commitment and a mandate and the resources that you need to do your job. Sitting underneath that, sometimes you have an implementation committee. This might be your boss's level of people like that can allocate resources, help oversee the projects, and provide some advice. And then there's the working group level. This is where the technical work is being done. This is just a rough structure, and everyone does it differently. But if you're looking for ideas on how to create something like this, it's important that you recognise that you need awareness, at least at different levels within government. Just talking to technical people is not going to give you the continued resources that you need to make the work that you do sustainable. So thinking about that when you're developing the structure of what these committees might look like, or doing an assessment of what committees already exist within your government, because you may be able to just get geodesy or position, navigation, timing. Sometimes that's a bit sexier if you're trying to get that onto the agenda. You can say we have a PNT committee or a positioning committee within your country. You might get more traction. Then start assessing against all those groups that I mentioned before. Try and put those in a box of influence versus interest. You want to try and keep, in particular, the people who are highly influential and highly interested, you want to keep them happy. If they're influential but they have very little interest, You've got to find a way to get them involved. That's where a lot of your work needs to be done, because they're going to dictate whether or not you're successful. And then you have the low influential but interest. You still need to keep those groups informed and consult, because you want to keep them out of the other box where they're being influential and causing you problems. So a lot of this, as I mentioned before, I mentioned the Integrated Geospatial Information Framework. That came out of this body called UN-GGCE. And that's the United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management Committee of Experts. So this is set up within the UN, and it sits under ECOSOC, and it's really an opportunity for the geospatial people in your countries to get together and talk about common problems and try and find common solutions. And this group meets once per year in New York in August, and it also has a range of the working groups. So if you're thinking about that structure I mentioned before, this is the high-level strategic vision, and then underneath that, there's a range of different working groups and subcommittees that I'll show you. So they have a high-level group that discusses the strategy behind getting countries to get engaged with the IGIF and use it in their countries. We have a subcommittee on Geodesy. Hands up if you're on the subcommittee on Geodesy from this region. Up high, please, Gustavo. It's good, they're sitting up the front. That's great. So there's currently 42 different member states who have representatives on this subcommittee. So this is, if we think about that structure, that's like that middle implementation level. These are the people who are engaged in the work and feeding information back into the UN-GGCE Committee of Experts. There's also a range of expert groups on integration of statistical and geospatial information, land administration and management, disaster risk management, policy and legal frameworks, marine geospatial information, as well as a range of task teams and other working groups they've had in the past. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I just encourage you that if you're looking to get more engaged with other people from your region and from around the world and understand what is happening and what they're producing that could maybe assist you, it's great to check this out and get engaged with those groups. You'll meet a great network of people and hopefully learn something along the way as well. So, from an international governance perspective, if we're coming back to now look at this from a geodetic point of view, what is it that we are missing? These are just some dot points that I put together. We talked about the need for strong governance, and I mentioned the other day the analogy with the World Meteorological Organization. We don't have something like that for geodesy, and what that leads to is that we don't have dedicated resources to run our ground infrastructure, to run our data centers and analysis centers, geodetic product development centers. All of that operational funding doesn't exist. We also are struggling to maintain the capital infrastructure, the SLR, the VLBI observatories. We don't have a fund where we can make sure that these capital projects and big infrastructure projects are continuing to be able to operate sustainably. We don't have a recognised global work plan. The work plan at the moment is ad hoc. If you think about what the SLR community are doing, or the VLBI community are doing, or the GNSS community are doing, they're all working in silos on their own. There is no one looking at this from a holistic perspective, making sure that we have accurate and reliable geodetic products going through to you and going through to satellite providers. The biggest thing that keeps me awake at night is we have no one who's responsible for the risk. This is the WMO structure. Now, I just want you to look at the colours here. The colours on the right-hand side, the orange colours, represent technical groups. So broadly speaking, you could make the analogy here with the World Meteorological Organization of saying, on the right-hand side, we're talking about what the science community would be working on. This would be similar to what the IAG are currently doing. and the services that they're providing. The bit that we don't have from a geodetic point of view is this part on the left-hand side. The regional associations where you have government authorities that are playing a role in ensuring that we have a geodetic system that is accurate and consistent. The joy of this WMO structure, the beauty of this WMO structure, is that it brings together the policy people with the technical scientific people together, and then they have an executive council and a congress that meets every 4 years. They're setting out the work plan of what we need for meteorology into the future. Then the executive council has the role to make sure that happens. They're the implementers and responsible for day-to-day operations. And they are talking to the policy people about their needs. They're talking to the technical scientific community about their needs to make sure that all the risks are managed and the money is flowing where it needs to flow. We don't have this structure for geodesy. I've now just got a couple of examples of how you can see government departments are set up. This is an example from Germany, and you can see that they have it's similar to what I think you have from your areas. You have a mapping or geodesy department, and in that you have your top level where you've got your directors, and then underneath that you have your working groups. In the case of what we see here with the in particular South and Central American groups, even the North American groups, this is not too dissimilar to the kind of governance structure that you have within your countries. This is an example of the legislation and regulations that I was talking about before from an Australian perspective. And if you have a look at the Australian Geodesy fact book that Ryan showed the other day, a lot of the information that we had included in that comes from this kind of regulation. And as you can see, it's just listing the facts. And as we talked about, you may know what that is, but you've got to document it. And in this case, it's documented in a national measurement determination. This is explaining how positioning has to be done in Australia. You need to meet this standard. This is a way of communicating up to very senior levels of government around the importance of what you do. You might see it as an overhead or extra work that you need to do, but it is valuable to be progressing this information up to senior levels so they understand the value of your GNSS network or your SLR or VLBI operations that you're performing. And we go down to the detail of even in the schedule listing the coordinates. So these are the coordinates. We call them Australian Fiducial Network. There's 109 stations that have coordinates listed with respect to 2020, epoch of 2020, with their uncertainties and their velocities. This is the datum defining network in Australia. If you're trying to determine position in Australia, it's all with respect to these datum coordinates, 109 coordinates throughout Australia, making it very clear the traceability of how position is computed.
Pardon me, that's in your laws?
Yes, so at the highest level, we have a national measurement determination. That's what it's called. And that determination is Australia-wide. Then what happens is the state governments are responsible for implementing that in their state. But they refer to that regulation in order to define the datum for their cadastre and things like that. Everything is traced back to those 109 points in Australia.
Thanks. No, I don't think I still understand. If for it to be in law, it has to go through Parliament, and that takes a lot of time. So that's what I was trying to understand, and I notice it's 2020, so it's quite recent. How do you, as a, iterate it, or is it something that it just allows you to one ministry to just update it as they need it?
No, it's an excellent question. So it's not a law, it's a determination. In some countries that we've worked with, they have it in law, or actually I try and push them not to put it in law because, as you said, it's very hard to do. We're fortunate in Australia that there is an institute called the National Measurement Institute. They are given the authority to change these based on new evidence or new information that comes available. So instead of it being a law, they have the authority to make new determinations. So we, as the science organisation, engage with them. We prove to them that this is the correct thing to do, and then we can update that determination. So we updated it in, I think it was 1997, then 2012, and then 2020. So it gets adjusted semi-regularly, but it's a lot easier because it doesn't have to go through Parliament.
Thanks. If you could permit me, well, that creates another question that I want to follow up on. Then there's a requirement. How do you handle the requirement that users must go back to the most recent thing? Because it's a matter then, I'm not sure, are you disseminating it, or is more that they come to it? How do you deal with that in law, or is it not in law?
It's, again, great question, and it depends on the user. We, as the, when we were in the Commonwealth government, all we do is set that determination. In terms of how that's applied and regulated within the state governments, particularly with things like cadastre or cadastral, with construction work and things like that, the states would each have their own regulation, and the states would then update their state government regulations to say, to position within the state for cadastre, you must abide by this particular datum. So all they do is dictate what datum needs to be used. So in the case of cadastre, they would say you need to use GDA 2020 in order to lodge your cadastral paperwork. So the federal government was setting the rules saying, here's 109 points that define position. We put that in a determination. We then define the datum, GDA 2020, based on those 109 points. And then it comes down to the states. They have their own rules to say you need to refer to GDA 2020. And so that, they call it a link of traceability. Down to a street corner now with the cadastre, you can trace that all the way back, but different agencies take the responsibility for keeping either state government regulations up to date or determinations or the fiducial network up to date. It's complex. And it doesn't mean you've got to copy the way that Australia do it. The bit you do need to consider is what laws do we have around positioning in Guyana, for example. So if you know what that is, then you've just got to think about how do I make sure I have traceability back to that? And so we've been talking to some countries around ITRF and the use of ITRF. That works, but you've got to make sure you don't have something in your government regulations that says you need to be referenced to this datum. Because if you then start doing cadastral work in ITRF, you have no traceability back to the laws in your country.
Thanks. It sounds a bit decentralized, and I can imagine a state not implementing those regulations causing havoc. Yeah.
Yes, it can be. I would say that it's also very specific to the nation as well, because of the way that it's set up in terms of its constitution. But one of the things also, I think, is that as you are completing your initial Geodesy fact book, if you remember back to the Australian example, we made reference back to the National Measurement Institute. So we were putting in that document to say, here is Geoscience Australia's definition of the latest realization of a geodetic datum. But here are our traces back to the legal documents that Australia, from a federal level and a state government level, need to operate. So they're also worth considering, that as you fill in your Geodesy fact book, you identify these determinations or regulations which are going to be specific to your nation. They're not going to be the same as in Costa Rica or Colombia or Panama. So you really have to investigate your nation's particular situation. Thanks.
Did we have any other questions on that? You can talk, yeah, go for it.
So I just want to go back to the working group that you say that. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, just a question on the working group that we should establish. Like in Canada, we have the the academic group, the Canadian Geodetic Science Advisory Committee. We also have the group with the provinces and territories. And then we have the Position, Navigation, and Timing Board, which includes Department of Defense and the metrology agencies. But you know, you can spend a lot of effort in each of those groups, because there is the discussions normally happen around common interest that usually geodesy is not common, right? You're defending the backbone of everything, but it's not the top priority that each minister had defined for each of those stakeholders, right? So what worked in Australia? Like, what type of group should we be aiming for? I suggested at some point that we can include private sector, and I almost get shot. So then I say, well, maybe I just should start the group with the private sector, but then it will be a mixed group. Like, what worked in Australia to push geodesy, investments in geodesy?
Yeah, I think what we found worked best. So we did have just a government level group, because there's certain information that you can't share with the private sector, right? But what we found worked best is when, if you're trying to instigate this, we started by having separate conversations to find what the pain points were. For example, with the Air Services Group, you know, they're dealing with ICAO standards and discussions around WGS84, the differences between that and datums in Australia. So you got to touch on pain points with them. With the Defence Group, they were worried about jamming and spoofing and resilience. So I think it helps to find particular pain points from each of your stakeholders, then explain how the work with geodesy is relevant to them. That's normally enough to bring them to the table, particularly with some of those big stakeholders. Private sector, though, we didn't invite them to that group because it is government discussions, but then we had a separate advisory council that you would have, and that would not have all your defence ICAO people in there, but you again chair that group with an advisory council to talk about the benefits that you can get from having increased infrastructure or better infrastructure, public-private partnerships. You have separate discussions with that advisory council.
So who chaired that group?
Geoscience Australia.
Okay.
And the biggest challenge there, and something you need to consider, is who do you invite and who doesn't get invited. That can sometimes create tension because it looks like you're providing favour to certain parts of the public sector, private sector. So you've got to be careful about how you set that up. All right, that's at the end of our slides. Any other comments, questions around this topic? Yes, thank you.
Buenos días. Sí, para este tema a nosotros acá, perdón, acá en el IGM nos ha servido mucho, por ejemplo, el certificado que nos han enviado ustedes de partner de Centro de Excelencia. Eso ha solidificado la gobernanza, ¿cierto? Y en ese sentido, nosotros, por ejemplo, adoptamos una estrategia en los años 2000, cuando pasamos a nuestro marco de referencia geocéntrico, de mantener el nombre SIRGAS en nuestro marco de referencia, SIRGAS Chile, y productos derivados de aquello. Entonces también, y esto va dirigido también a ustedes, nos gustaría también tener algún certificado o que apareciera en algún lugar que el representante nacional en SIRGAS es el IGM. Porque aparecen los países, aparecen como Chile, pero no especifica, digamos, en algún estamento legal, o no legal, sino formal, que es el IGM el representante en SIRGAS. Estuvo en los estatutos pasados, en los estatutos nuevos se cambió. Nosotros en su momento dijimos, o propusimos que no, pero parece que esa moción no contrató, fue la administración anterior de SIRGAS. Entonces también nos gustaría, si es que es posible, desde nuestro punto de vista, tener algún certificado o que aparezca en los estatutos o alguna resolución Porque a nosotros nos ayuda mucho por el tema de gobernanza y de repente de justificar. Muchas veces los políticos no ven la parte técnica, sino que ven resultados, indicadores, pero también ven la parte, ven el marco legal y esto nos ayuda mucho.
Sí, the certificate is easy to do, but I guess the bigger question is, CIRGAS is a voluntary organization, right? We're not a legal entity, and I guess that could be an issue when it comes to things like budget, right? Say we get a budget to do, I don't know, core stations across Latin America. We don't have an institutional account and things like that. Like that's just food for thought for for Nick and us to think about how can we better solidify the regional institutions to enable them to have more leverage with the governments. But yeah, the certificate is that's easy. Gustavo can do that for sure. Yeah, but we'll have to think about it for the region. Yeah.
So the right-hand side here, don't worry about the title, the right-hand side is what CIRGAS does. And as we were chatting yesterday evening, you need to find the left-hand side here within the Americas to see if something already exists. The current structure for UN-GGCE is not strong enough, and it's not a financial body either. They're not going to handle money. But do you have a regional body that already handles that policy level operational governance across the Americas? If that exists, that's where you can be getting the money aspect handled. You need to not try and add extra work to what CIRGAS does. You need to create another body or lean on an already existing other body or agency to do that work across the Americas and do that operational aspect. We as geodesists, I find in this community, we feel like we have to take on everything and do it all ourselves. We've got to start doing things differently. We need to find duplicates of ourselves in policy, in defense departments. We can't do everything ourselves. So as I was saying, from an international structure, if that IAG exists on that side, my proposal for improved governance is not to grow IAG or turn it into a business to do the operational bit, but we need to create this other part so that there is someone doing the day-to-day operations and making sure that our infrastructure is working, and the IAG scientists can go back to doing their science. And they can't keep doing both pieces of work. So you can think about that from a regional perspective as well. You need to find this operational arm on the left that can handle the money. That's the only way this is going to be sustainable. And that only happens by going back to your national level. You have to start nationally. You need to build that national level governance group. From that, all the national level governance groups, the risk gets identified. Hopefully then they'll be happier to work regionally. But if you try and get them to do that now, they're unlikely to do it because within your own government, they don't have that awareness. So you've got to build it up nationally, then you build regionally, and then hopefully we can build something internationally. So the example we talked about yesterday, just for everyone else's point of view, the example of what this is within Europe is the European Commission. The European Commission is already a body that does this kind of work, and they are looking at things like the risk and the issues associated with things like Earth observation. There is a particular group within the European Commission focused on that, making sure that they have a good supply chain for Earth observation, but they don't have one for geodesy. So we have been working with them to highlight that risk. We've been working with member states in Europe to highlight that risk. And now they are starting to form a task force to deal with that risk from a policy perspective on the left-hand side. It's not the same people who are doing the science. It's a completely separate group of people who sit in policy departments within European countries. That's what needs to be mirrored in different regions around the world. Yeah, but it means that you don't have to do it, right? Because at the moment, we all say, oh, I'm going to do it. I'm going to have to do it. It's not you. You've got to find someone else who's going to take this responsibility.
It wasn't a tough question. It was a simple question. It's a tough answer to find.
I'm still a bit struggling what we would need on national level. We have some things in European Netherlands, but it's also largely based on that organizations just cooperate. That's in our culture. And in the Caribbean Netherlands, it's so small that making things formal seems not the right way to go. So I'm not sure if we are missing something which we should have.
No, that's a good question, and it has to be fit for purpose. So I've talked with people like Leonard and dear friend Frank before he passed, and Cora around this from Netherlands, right? And it's really around, particularly for Netherlands in Europe, it's around getting the big government departments aware. And I know Leonard in particular had done a lot of work with interministerial advisors to try and build that. It may still be an informal structure as it is in the Netherlands, but I think there's greater awareness now across government because they have been very supportive of this European Commission work that's happening. So you may not have a formalised structure within the Netherlands, but the process has been informal and, as you said, collaborative. It's led to the result that was needed to build that regional influence. In smaller states, again, it's not about establishing a new committee. It may just be about trying to get this discussion about positioning in particular. You wouldn't talk about geodesy, but what positioning needs do we have within our region? Getting that on the agenda of some of these formal groups so that it is being discussed across government. I wouldn't look to establish anything new. Maybe just try and get on the agenda of an existing group of governments discussions where they talk to each other. Yeah. Jose.
I think a problem with that may be one in some country of the world the data is not open. If the institution or the private sector sell the products, that is a problem, for example, in IGS, in Sirgas, because if you work together and another institution sell the data that is management open for all the world, that is, or maybe several happens one problems in the countries or maybe in the borders. In that case, what is your advice, opinion?
I think there's still a lot that you can do together. You know, when it comes to talking about the core geodesy components that I'm referring to, it's around making sure that you have analysis centers, data centers, GNSS is operating. I think as long as it's clear who has the roles and responsibilities. Sometimes you don't need to get into the data sharing. There's a lot that you can do in that back end of the supply chain to make sure that roles, responsibilities and risks are managed. Yeah, so each country is different and this governance structure you have needs to be fit for purpose. And this is where you might discuss some of that, as I said, within the government bodies, but then you'd have a much stronger collaboration with maybe your advisory committee from your private sector. So who controls what, it can vary, but you've got to make sure the two link up. So it's a great question. Yeah.
Just that was an interesting point there, and I would like to ask or talk about industry in a moment, but one thing I would just like to understand from people who are working for government organizations. Here in some of your country reports, some countries have different, or they have separate groups looking after the the geodesy and the mapping. I'm really interested to know whether you can admit to us, does your country already have a good two-way discussion around geodesy and mapping, just at government, not with industry? Or does anybody say we could improve our discussion within our own organizations about how geodesy and mapping and surveying work?
Can you define good, Ryan?
How long have you got?
How long have you got? Okay, I'll put it another way. Who would like to have better communication and interaction at their government level around geodesy and mapping? Okay, so there's work to be done even at the government internal level. It's not that you should avoid then speaking with the academic and international partners in industry, but if your own organization could benefit from improvement, there's already a very good first start.